Which animal would you go with? Yeah, vote for apes. Makes sense. Or is it going with dogs? I think also would be a good contender. Another vote for dogs. Definitely might have like the best like emotional intelligence. Christina going with cats. Other side of the coin there. Yeah. Yeah, random question, but I think it's an interesting one to think about. Um, it's a good point, Jimmy. You know, apes can already do sign language, so they're not far off. So, I'm going with ravens. Um, say if you ever like go down a Wikipedia like sinkhole, reading about them, like crazy smart animals. They like remember people. They remember like people who were nice to them versus who was mean to them. Um, Interestingness. Interesting. Okay. Good deal. Let's go ahead and jump over to the vocab slide. Don't have a huge amount of vocabulary, but take a moment to jot that down. Um, as you're doing so, again, big reminder is we are 2 weeks out till the end of the school year, which means you have 2 weeks left to get your U.S. history grade where you want it to be. Um, definitely for some people, that's going to need to include getting your family history project turned in. If you haven't already, obviously reach out, email me if you need help with that. Um, Also, want just to kind of bring it to your attention, it was posted in the course announcements this week, but there is an extra credit project available, similar to what was available last semester, but doing it for this semester of kind of reflecting back on everything we've talked about this semester, going all the way back to the Great Depression. What have stood out as being the 5 most historical events from this semester in terms of what do you feel like has had the biggest impact on the United States, and or the American people? So that is an optional assignment, but if you're, trying to find a way to get some extra points in the grade book, you do have that available to you. And then give me one moment here to send out the email to those who are running late today. An awesomeness. Glad to hear it. All right. And then our game plan for today, um, we're starting to get into historical events that you all would have been alive for. You probably don't remember them because you would have been super little, but I do think that is interesting once you start getting into the pieces of history that you were actually alive for. Um, as we'll kind of get into the second half of the 2000 aughts, I guess is how you'd refer to it. And awesome, Mira. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, yeah. Um, so we'll talk about Hurricane Katrina, the Great Recession, Too Big to Fail. And I think today's class is maybe going to be the best class to also try to address this student question. I'm not going to read through all of it. It's obviously a very well thought out question. But basically, a student asking about political division in the United States and the growing hostility we see between political parties. That it's not really just a professional debate on ideas, but can oftentimes get really ugly and personal. And that isn't exactly something brand new to the United States. If you, for example, go back through the 1800s, there were some really ugly um, presidential elections in the 1800s. Um, as you might imagine, things also got pretty heated and personal as we got closer and closer to the Civil War. Um, but from the 1940s through, we'll say, roughly the 1980s, um, there was perhaps more civility to US politics. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party obviously had disagreements, um, but there wasn't the division like we see today. And probably part of that was things like World War II and then the Cold War kind of bringing the country together, kind of in many ways forced Republicans and Democrats to work together. Um, I, historians will kind of debate where you really start to see that reemergence of personal vicious politics. Um, but I would argue the 1990s is really when we start to see that reemerge. You have a new Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, who really encouraged his Republican colleagues um, to not play nice with Democrats, including things like telling them, don't sit with Democrats during lunch, don't hang out with them, don't be friends with them. Um, he also oversees a very aggressive um, campaign against President Bill Clinton, trying to dig up anything he can find to take Clinton down, ultimately leading to uh, impeaching President Clinton over lying about an affair, which um, he did do, and obviously that's wrong. But at the same time, there were many Americans who argued that that was kind of more of a personal situation, not necessarily something that justified removing a president from power. And in fact, it did kind of backfire on the Republicans and increase Clinton's popularity. Then, when Bush became president, we had 9/11. And again, that kind of lowered the political temperature because once again, the two parties kind of came together in the aftermath of 9/11. But as you're going to kind of see here today, as we enter into the Obama presidential years, that political division is going to kind of reemerge. So we'll kind of hit upon this question more as we get through today's material. So up until this point, we've really kind of been focusing on foreign policy in the 2000s. In the aftermath of 9/11, America got very heavily involved in events in other parts of the world, especially Afghanistan and Iraq. So I now kind of want to wind the clock back and look at a couple of things that were happening back home within the United States during the Bush years. And one of the most significant social developments was the country evolving in its views regarding homosexuals and the LGBTQ community at large. As we've previously talked about, a person being homosexual was often something that people felt like they had to keep private because there was a lot of stigma, a lot of hostility towards members of the LGBTQ community throughout the 20th century. But by the late 90s into the 2000s, we're starting to see growing public acceptance. And so in 2004, we end up then having the first state to legalize same sex marriage um, in Massachusetts following a state Supreme Court ruling. So for the first time in modern U.S. history, same-sex couples could now get married if they moved to Massachusetts, um, and that kind of is the beginning of the opening of the door, so to speak. And then you can see that more and more states will start to follow along. Connecticut, Iowa, Vermont, the District of Columbia, which is the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., New Hampshire, and New York uh, will start to legalize gay marriage. Other states will follow. Um, but when Massachusetts becomes the first state to legalize gay marriage, that really kind of opened up the conversation nationwide. Um, should that be allowed or not? Obviously that was something that was celebrated within the LGBTQ community. But in 2004, we also saw it triggering a strong conservative reaction and opposition. It ended up being a major issue in the presidential debates in 2004 when President Bush runs and wins re-election. And so we saw a lot of counter protests. Oftentimes with conservatives making arguments focusing on protecting tradition or making appeals to religious beliefs, arguing that their religious views led them to be opposed to the concept of gay marriage. And yes, Merritt, yeah, to your comment, sorry, I just now saw it. Yes. Very, very true that you do. Unfortunately, you do see many members of the LGBTQ community who, for one reason or another, may feel like they still do need to keep that private. So, kind of looking at some of these signs here on the whiteboard, does this remind you of anything? Does this at all seem similar to events we've previously seen in this class? Any examples where people opposed social change because they wanted to stick with tradition? They wanted to stick with the old way of doing things. Where have we maybe seen this before where people pushed back against social change because they didn't want things to change? They wanted America to stay the same, or they wanted things to go back to how they were in the past. Yeah, sure, Mayor. Yeah, it's not one we've really talked about in this class, but definitely that is another example of social change we've seen over time. That in the past it was much more common to use physical forms of punishment against children. And over time, as a society, we've increasingly moved away from that. But definitely, you do see some people who push a bit back against that and say, well, we spanked or hit kids all the time when I was growing up. Um, I don't see why we need to change it. So sure, yeah, kind of that back in my day kind of mentality. Sure, sure. Um, can we think of any examples of groups of Americans who wanted things to change and found resistance to that? Maybe different groups of Americans who felt like things weren't fair in the past and wanted things to change to try to make them more fair. Have we seen any examples of that? Um, Besides the LGBTQ community? Excellent, Kayla. Yeah, we've seen it multiple times. Um, different minority groups, whether that is racial or ethnic minorities. We definitely saw this with the civil rights movement in the 1950s and the 1960s. Um, and as you had African Americans trying to fight for social change, a lot of these similar arguments being made. People arguing that, well, you're changing tradition. We want to keep things as they were. Or a lot of people tried to use religion to justify racial segregation in the United States. Um, we saw it with women, fighting for greater gender equality in the United States, with a lot of pushback there of people saying, you're disrupting tradition, you're disrupting how the American family is supposed to operate. Um, if women are working, who's going to take care of the children? Um, which was an oversimplified argument, because the reality was you already had a lot of women who were working, and two, obviously a lot of families will figure that out one way or another. Um, yeah, definitely, other examples there as well. Native Americans. Um, so this we definitely can see a historical pattern here, that as different groups of Americans who historically have been discriminated against or have had limited rights have tried to push for equal rights, um, a conservative push back against that, arguing that it is going to hurt their traditions, um, or what they believe is the foundations of American society or the American family. Um, and so those that supported expanding marriage rights to same-sex couples um, argued that the First Amendment prevents religious views for being the basis for denying people rights. Um, because the First Amendment says, freedom of religion, that government cannot use any one religion as being like the religion of the United States. Um, and so this started to become a major political dividing point in the United States, where increasingly we're going to see the Democratic Party embrace LGBTQ rights, and the Republican Party embrace that concept of tradition and wanting to keep things as they have been in the past. Um, Now, back in 2004, you still had a minority of Americans who were in support of gay marriage. We can see that only 42% of Americans back then believed that gay marriage should be valid. But looking at this chart, what seems to have happened to the opinion on gay marriage over time, basically over the course of your lifetime. Yeah, we've seen, historically speaking, a very quick shift in opinion in the United States. Um, Historically, it can take the country a long time to change its mind about social issues. Um, on the topic of gay marriage, really just within a generation, we've seen dramatic change with nowadays, roughly 2/3 of the country being in support for gay marriage. But going back to Mira's earlier comment, um, about some people still feeling pressured to kind of hide their sexual orientation, you still have a third of the country that is opposed to it, and that number can definitely be higher depending on where in the country we're talking about, or the kind of community that we're looking at. One of the other major events of the 2000s is in August of 2005, the arrival of Hurricane Katrina. Um, Hurricanes have been an ongoing challenge for countries that are in or along the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic coastline. There have been very serious hurricanes before Hurricane Katrina. Um, but as someone who personally lived through the arrival of Hurricane Katrina, it it did kind of stand out in grabbing the nation's attention. Um, in part, because it was such a large hurricane, a Category 5 hurricane, and because it tragically was on a direct path with the city of New Orleans in the state of Louisiana. Um, and so I have a couple of photographs from Hurricane Katrina to kind of share with you, just to hopefully kind of illustrate the impact of it. Um, so what you see here is hours before Hurricane Katrina was set to hit. As people were scrambling to try to get out of the city of New Orleans, which is not a very easy city to get out of because it's surrounded by a lot of water. So there's only kind of like a couple of main, highway bridges you can take to try to get out of the city. Traffic quickly backed up. You know, Traffic came to a standstill. So the evacuation of New Orleans did not go well. Um, because New Orleans is surrounded by so much water, it's also very vulnerable to flooding. And so New Orleans has a series of channels known as levees that are supposed to be designed to contain and help direct water out of the city. But when Hurricane Katrina came and brought in so much water and rain, um, that broke the weakened levee system, and some of these levee walls collapsed. At which point, then all of this water, starts flooding out into the city itself. Um, Here is a photograph of downtown New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. You can see that much of the city is underwater compared to what it would kind of look like today. Um, because so many people either couldn't get out of the city or ignored the warnings that they needed to get out of the city, and then their homes got flooded. The sports stadium kind of became a makeshift rescue center of ultimately hundreds of people staying within the stadium, which quickly overwhelmed it as a shelter. Um, with all the flooding, plumbing wasn't working, so people going to the bathroom and sewage became a real issue. If you ever read people's accounts of staying here at the dome, that's one of the first things they talk about is just like how bad it smelled, um, how it quickly became an issue getting access to actual clean drinking water. Um, and so Hurricane Katrina ends up being significant. One, as a conversation piece of the growing issue of climate change. As you may recall, a couple of classes back, the Bush administration initially was very dismissive towards the issue of climate change, wasn't worried about it. But as the nation will continue to experience, we're going to increasingly see more and more extreme weather events like Hurricane Katrina, um, more large scale hurricanes, more flooding. Out west, there's going to be more wildfires, more drought, as climate patterns change and become more extreme as a result of climate change. Hurricane Katrina also brought attention to America's crumbling infrastructure. Um, for basically the past 20 to 30 years, um, in part as a result of cutting taxes, government increasingly did not have the money to keep all of our infrastructure in tip top shape. And infrastructure is kind of one of those things where, you can get by for a couple of years not repairing, every little thing that comes up, but eventually that's going to come back to bite you. And it really did for the city of New Orleans, who for years did not provide the necessary repairs to their levee system. And then when you have a big storm like Hurricane Katrina show up, punches a hole in the levee walls and creates a huge disaster. Uh, For example, one of the reasons why a priority of the Biden administration has been infrastructure repair, going out and trying to repair the nation's, bridges, tunnels, things like that. This also damaged the credibility of the Bush administration, because there's a government agency known as FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and its job is to respond whenever there kind of is a national crisis like this of getting food, water, clothing, to people who need it, who have just gone through, a major crisis like this. Well, when the Department of Homeland Security was created, FEMA got absorbed into that department, and a lot of its resources got focused more on terrorism, um, with the Bush administration putting people in charge of FEMA who did not have any previous experience in emergency response. Um, and so FEMA ultimately does a very poor job, um, in trying to get help to the people of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Um, and so it kind of served as an important reminder of why it's important to have good government in place, um, and people who have the right expertise for the job they've been put in place to do. Because when the country goes through a crisis, you want to make sure the government is able to effectively respond to that. But things only continue to be challenging for the state of Louisiana. Um, it is a state that is very quickly disappearing. Um, when you look at a map of the United States, oftentimes it's going to show Louisiana as looking something like this. Louisiana hasn't looked like that since the 1800s. Louisiana today looks a lot more like this. Just much of its southern coastline has washed away or become flooded. Um, and again, is a pretty powerful example of the impact of climate on the United States. Um, so when you combine the failures of with Hurricane Katrina and the growing controversies with the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that we talked about on Monday, the 2006 midterm elections were not a good year for the Republicans. A growing number of Americans felt like government needed to go in a different direction, resulting in the Democratic Party taking both houses of Congress in 2006. That ends up being significant because it then leads to the election of the first female Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, um, which would have made her the most powerful woman in the US government up to that point in time. As oftentimes the Speaker of the House is viewed as being, you know, arguably the third most powerful position in government, just below the president and the vice president. Now, we didn't have class on Wednesday, but there were a series of videos assigned in the course plan over the Great Recession. So hopefully you watched those videos, and they kind of illuminated the causes of the Great Recession. To make a long story short, banks started to get risky with giving out loans for people to buy houses, ultimately giving them to people who clearly did not have the financial situation to actually be able to afford the home loan. But the reason why banks were doing that is because on one hand, you had a lot of investors buying up home loan debt. And so banks were like, oh, well, we'll give people these loans and then these investors will buy the debt off of us. Or the thought was, well, if these people ultimately can't pay off their home loan, the bank then just repossesses the home and then the bank owns the home and can sell it for a profit. And so that created a housing bubble in the United States, where housing prices just continued to go up beyond what they were actually valued. And so then in 2008, that bubble burst. Banks, specifically investment banks, lost a whole lot of money real fast, couldn't cover their expenses, and started to go under. That creates then a panic in the stock market. Stock prices start to drop, and we have the event known as the Great Recession. The largest economic crisis in the United States since the Great Depression. And you can see it here where, throughout the 2000s, the American economy was always growing, sometimes faster than others, but above zero. But then with the Great Recession, we actually see negative economic growth. The economy shrinks. And part of the reason for the Great Recession is over the past 30 years, attitudes towards government had changed. You may recall that, going back to the 1930s, after the Great Depression, when FDR was president, as part of the New Deal, a bunch of new regulations were put in place for government to keep an eye on banks and the stock market and the economy, things like Glass-Steagall, that kept commercial investment banking separate. But then going into the 1980s, by that point, the country was 50 years removed from the Great Depression. And so that fear that people had during the Great Depression of another economic catastrophe had kind of faded away. And conservatives instead were increasingly pushing for deregulation, for government to get out of keeping an eye on the economy, believing that they were holding the economy back. Again, probably most famously illustrated by Reagan's quote of "Government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem." And so in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, a lot of different government regulations regarding the stock market and banking were removed. That did provide financial systems with more flexibility and probably and made more money as a result. But some economists would argue that it also led banks to make riskier financial decisions that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to make had those financial regulations been kept in place. And so when the housing bubble bursts and investment banks start to go under, President Bush, being a conservative Republican, initially wants the government to do nothing because his viewpoint is that government shouldn't be involved in the economy. That, if a bank as a business makes a bad decision, that's on them. They have to live with the consequences of that. But as more and more banks start to go under, it becomes clear that it's causing a chain reaction. That as one bank goes under, that puts pressure on another bank and causes another bank to go under. And so it's increasingly looking like America's largest financial institutions may go under and perhaps cause a total economic collapse. President Bush changes his opinion and ultimately supports a massive government bailout known as TARP, where the government will provide the funds to keep these large banks from going out of business. Now, if you had to take a guess, how do you think voters might feel about that? About the government spending very large amounts of money to help these banks out and get them back on their feet. How might the average American feel about that, or what might their reaction to that be? Yeah, some people might not like it. Why? Why might some people have a problem with this? And perhaps to help us out, let's take a look at this political cartoon. What seems to be the message of this political cartoon in helping out these big banks like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Bear Stearns? Because according to the cartoon, who or what is going to be responsible for catching these falling banks? Excellent, Kaylee and Mary. Yeah. Taxpayers, tax dollars. Um, so, whereas, in response to the Great Depression, FDR, created the New Deal, which created a lot of programs to help everyday Americans out during that economic crisis. In response to the Great Recession, government is largely going to focus on providing assistance to these large banks to keep them from going under, which on one hand was arguably necessary, because if all of these banks did go under, it would have created a chain reaction that would have created an even bigger economic crisis for the entire country. But that is going to cause a lot of Americans to be upset, because they're going to feel like government is helping out, these wealthy bankers who made a lot of money making risky financial decisions. And then when those financial decisions went south, the government came in and took care of them. And so you're going to have a lot of American people saying, well, what about us? You're helping these wealthy banks from going under. But what about the rest of the American people? All of our tax dollars are going to help out these big banks. And so it is also going to create a lot of resentment among a lot of American voters. Leading into this concept of too big to fail, that over time, different businesses in the United States had gotten larger and larger, in part by buying up or merging with other businesses. And so as these businesses become larger and larger, they make up a bigger piece of the economy, to the point that arguably, as a country, we can no longer allow those businesses to go out of business, because it would economically destroy things. As another comparison, you think about if a large company like Walmart or Amazon would go out of business today suddenly. That would be a disaster for the United States. So many people work for those businesses. So many people depend on those businesses. There's a lot of places where, maybe Walmart's the only place you can go to get groceries now in your community. And if Walmart were to go out of business, you would have an entire community that no longer has a place to get groceries. And so that was the same kind of issue with these banks, that if government did not come in and bail them out, they would have basically taken the whole economy down with them. But when you combine the events of the Great Recession with the ongoing frustrations with the war on terrorism, by the end of Bush's presidency, he is incredibly unpopular, which basically meant that it was going to be a very tough presidential election for whoever the Republican was running in 2008. By that point, many Americans are looking for a change, wanting to go in a different direction. And as a result, electing the nation's first African-American president, Barack Obama, who very much ran on this message of hope and change, who provided a sense of optimism that we could turn the corner on the war on terrorism, that we could use the Great Recession as an opportunity to rebuild our economy, to better benefit all Americans, and not just the rich people at the top. Obama also wanted to present himself as being a bipartisan president, that he would be someone who would happily work with Democrats and Republicans to get things done for the good of the country. Um, in fact, the speech that really kind of put him on the radar to be president in the first place um, was a speech arguing that America shouldn't be viewed as a divided country. Um, that Democrats and Republicans live together throughout the United States. That we're on the same team. We should work together. He, for example, once he becomes president, is going to try to nominate a record number of people from the opposite party to serve in his candidate. Now, not all of them will accept, but that was at least his sales pitch. That's how he wanted to present things. But he's not going to find a whole lot of cooperation among Republicans in Congress, who are largely going to use the tactics of Newt Gingrich, as I mentioned at the start of class, to oppose the Obama administration. Because basically the thought process was that Obama advertised himself to voters that he was going to be a bipartisan president who would work with Republicans to try to get things done. And so Republicans in Congress then had the thought of, well, if we never work with the Obama administration and things don't get done, we would then be able to prove that his presidency was a failure, and potentially then voters might change their mind and vote a Republican in 2012. Perhaps best illustrated by the leader of Senate Republicans, Senator Mitch McConnell, who said, the single most important thing we want to achieve is for President Obama to be a one-term president. And so we once again see these political divisions emerge, where the conversation isn't really about, well, what can we agree on together of, what would be good for the country? But instead, how can we deny the other party any political victories so that voters will view them as being a failure? And that this isn't just limited to President Obama in his struggle with congressional Republicans. We flash forward, one of the big goals of the Trump administration was to try to build a border wall. Democrats in Congress are going to do everything they can to try to block that, to deny him that achievement. Or more recently, the Biden administration was willing to negotiate on an immigration law to address immigration concerns. And at the last minute, Republicans in Congress backed out on that because they didn't want to give President Biden an immigration win heading into the upcoming presidential election. And so that's been an increasing concern in American politics, that politicians seem to increasingly be concerned on denying the other party any wins versus trying to be proactive and thinking about, well, how can we work together to try to get things done that would be good for the country? So that kind of ties into that student question at the start of class. But I see we are unfortunately out of time, so we will end there for today. As always, if you have any questions, stick around, let me know. Don't forget about doing your weekly reflection, working on your family history project if you haven't gotten that turned in already. But then Otherwise, hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you here next week. You are good to go. Thanks, Carter. You too. You too, Mira. See ya.